Hi, I'm Peter Lindstrom. I'm the inventor of the device that I'm sitting on right now, which is something I call the Microtraction Bed. So I invented this bed to treat my own low back pain, which I started getting a little over a decade ago. I tried everything short of surgery to treat it, so that would be physical therapy, heat, ice, strengthening exercises, stretching exercises, acupressure, acupuncture, steroid injection in my low back, a procedure called nerve ablation, tried transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation. Really nothing worked. And at that point, the only thing left was surgery, and I was advised against that by 2 out of the 3 physicians that I consulted. At that point, I started to think about maybe new creative solutions, something new I could make that would help me out, and that's how I came up with this. So, in coming up with this, I was inspired by indigenous body modification, interestingly enough. So, in some indigenous tribes, they hang weights from their ears, from their noses, from other body parts, and over a long period of time, these small forces actually cause a lengthening of those body parts. And so I thought maybe I can do something similar for my spine. Now, why would I want to do this? Well, I've had a couple of MRIs done of my back, and they both showed that I have degenerative disc disease in L5-S1, which is the lowermost disc, and then also somewhat in some of the discs above it. So I thought, well, maybe that compression of that disc, if I could get a little bit of traction going on all night long while I'm sleeping, maybe that disc could be expanded a little bit. And I also had another reason to hope that that might be true, because as it turns out, the human spine actually does decompress a little bit at night all on its own. Even if there's no traction, you end up being a little bit taller in the morning than when you went to bed, just because your spine expands a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. And so I thought, okay, maybe I can build something that will sort of augment that natural process and decompress my spine even a little bit further. So that's what this does, hopefully. I mean, it does put traction on my back, but I don't have a lot of scientific evidence. All I have is my own experience, which is that it's made a big difference for me. Okay, so let's get into the specifics of how it works. The bed is divided into 3 sections. There's a foot section here, there's a head section here, and then there's the center section that I'm sitting on. The foot section and the head section don't move. The center section, though, is able to move back and forth by a small amount. Now, when my weight is on the center section, it moves towards the foot of the bed. Like you can see right here, it's moved towards the foot of the bed. When I take my weight off the center section, it moves towards the head of the bed, like that. And then when I put my weight back on, it moves towards the foot of the bed. So this is very useful because it allows for hands-free operation of the bed while I'm lying down, which I'll demonstrate now. All right. So right now, the weight of my hips, thighs, and knees is on the center section. That makes the center section want to move towards the foot of the bed. And when it does that, it pulls my hips, thighs, and knees towards the foot of the bed. Now, if I want to change sleeping positions, all I need to do is raise my hips a little bit while I move, like this. When I change sleeping positions, I just lift my hips a little bit, and lifting my hips a little bit allows the center section to move towards the head of the bed, and that kind of resets the mechanism. Right? So it allows for hands-free operation while you're lying down. Right. So it does take a little bit of practice to sort of perfect that motion, but once you do, it becomes automatic. Like, it's not really something you think about that much. And it definitely doesn't disturb sleep. Now I'm at the rear of the bed. To change traction, you rotate the foot section upward, and underneath you'll find a movable slat. Move the slat backwards to increase traction and forwards to decrease it, like this. So that increases traction, that decreases traction. I've taken the sheet off the foot of the bed so that you can see it more clearly. The foot section can be moved forward or backward to accommodate users of different heights. I've now taken the sheet off the bed entirely so that we can see what's underneath it. If you lift up the center section, underneath you'll find a series of rubber blocks in a rack. You can take these rubber blocks out of the rack and then place them in these holes, one at a time. You can also place blocks underneath the head section in holes. So what does this do? It raises the seam between the head section and the center section, and it makes it into a little bit of a peak like this. Now, why would you want to do this? We will come to that when I go over the physics of how the device works. So now we're going to talk about the inner workings of the bed. I'm going to demonstrate things with the scale model here because it's easier to move the pieces around quickly when they're small. If I take the weight off the foot section, you can see that there's a rope that is attached to the rear of this frame here, and it runs forward over a pulley to a weight. So the weight pulls the center section forward. The weight is not what causes the traction, right? It pulls the center section forward. Right? Now, if I take the weight off, like this, I can remove it. Once I do that, I can pull out the center section. So the bed disassembles into 4 pieces. That makes it much easier for someone with low back pain to move the bed because each of the pieces weighs less. Now, what's important here to notice is how this center piece is supported. Right? At the front, there's a compressional support. This support right here is under compression. And when the center section moves backward, that compression support moves counterclockwise, as seen from this direction. At the back of the bed, right, this piece is a tensional support. Right? And it moves clockwise, as seen from this direction. It's very important that these two supports move in opposite directions. The reason for that will become clear when we go over the physics of the device. Let's now examine the physics of how the device operates. I know this looks a little complicated, but if you'll stick with me, you'll see something that I think is pretty clever. In front of you, you see 2 cross-sections of the bed. In the top cross-section, the center section of the bed, right here, has been pushed up close to the head section of the bed. In the bottom cross-section, the center section here is displaced towards the foot of the bed. The center section is composed of this mattress section and a wood frame underneath it, which I call the subframe. The subframe is supported by 2 supports. These supports are the compressional support right here and the tensional support right here. The compressional support is affixed by a hinge to the main frame of the bed and rotates about this hinge. You can see from these 2 drawings here and here that the compression support rotates clockwise about the hinge at its bottom. Likewise, you can see from the 2 drawings here and here that the tensional support rotates counterclockwise about the hinge at its top. The compressional support is attached via a hinge at its top to the upper left corner of the subframe. The tensional support is attached via a hinge to the lower right corner of the subframe. Let's now examine the forces acting on the center of mass of the center section. In the vertical direction, there's 2 forces. The first of these is the weight. The weight acts about the center of mass of the center section. The material of the center section is distributed in such a way so that the center of mass of the center section lies exactly halfway between the 2 supports. Therefore, the weight acts exactly halfway between the 2 supports. The second force that acts in the vertical direction is the normal force. This force is due to the user's hips, thighs, and knees pushing down on the mattress of the center section. This force is centered approximately underneath the user's hips, and the bed is set up so that the user's hips lie above the center of mass of the center section. Therefore, the normal force and the weight both act at a point halfway between the 2 supports. Because the net torque on the center section must be 0, this means that each support pushes up with the same force S, where S is the normal force plus the weight divided by 2. Next, let's look at the forces in the x direction. The positive x direction points towards the right. In the positive x direction, we have the x component of the force due to the tensional support. This is S tan B, where B is this angle here, the angle between the vertical and the direction of the tensional support. In the negative x direction, we have 3 forces. The first is the tension. This is the force exerted on the center section by the rope. Remember, that's the rope that goes over the pulley and then is attached to this weight here. We also have the force of friction right here. This is the force of friction exerted on the center section by the user's hips. And lastly, we have the x component of the force exerted on the center section by the compressional support. That's S tan A, where A is this angle here, the angle between the vertical and the direction of the compressional support. Let's sum our forces. The sum of forces in the x direction is equal to S tan B, the force in the positive x direction, minus S tan A, minus the force of friction, minus the tension. Solving for the force of friction and using the small angle approximation, we arrive at this formula here. Notice that the force of friction could be negative or positive depending upon the relative sizes of these two terms. When the user drops his hips onto the center section, N becomes large, therefore this first term becomes large, therefore F is positive, meaning that the user's hips are pulling the center section towards the head of the bed. By Newton's third law, this means that the center section pulls the user's hips towards the foot of the bed. This is what causes the traction. When the user raises his or her hips off the center section, N becomes 0. The largest term is then negative T, and F becomes negative. Now what does this mean? It means you no longer have a frictional force. Instead, what you really have is a new normal force exerted on the center section by the head section, which pushes that center section to the right. We now have a formula for what the friction force is as a function of these variables. But what happens when the center section displaces towards the rear of the bed? What happens to that friction force? Let's examine that. To begin with, the angle our compressional support makes with the vertical changes from A to A prime. This is equal to A minus C. Notice that the sign of the angle changes, and therefore the x component of the force on the center section due to the compressional support also changes sign. Meanwhile, our angle at the rear of the bed changes from B to B prime. Now B prime is equal to B minus C. In this case, B prime is still the same sign as angle B, but it's smaller. To find our new frictional force, we use that formula we found before, but now we replace B with B prime and A with A prime. We therefore replace B with B minus C and A with A minus C. We simplify that, and the C's cancel. Therefore, our formula for the friction force is the same when the center section is displaced towards the rear of the bed as it was when the center section was not displaced towards the rear of the bed. This means that the frictional force and therefore the traction stay constant. This is important because during the night, the center section can displace towards the rear of the bed, and you wouldn't want your traction to change when that occurs. Now this only happens if the small angle approximation is valid, that is, if we can replace tangent B with B and tangent A with A. Now these angles B and A aren't exactly small, which means that the small angle approximation will be approximate indeed. However, the frictional force will be constant enough for the device to functionally operate, and you really can't tell the difference when you're sleeping on it. Earlier in this video, I discussed the method by which a user can raise the seam between the center mattress section and the head mattress section. If one inclines the center mattress section at an angle with respect to the horizontal, then you can see in the free body diagram for the user's hips that the normal force now has an x component to it. That means that for a given force on the hip due to the spine, the friction force can be lower. This makes sleeping more comfortable. The angle shown here that the mattresses make with the horizontal is exaggerated somewhat. In reality, this angle would be smaller so that it's still comfortable to lie in the bed. Thank you for watching this video on my invention. To end, here's a picture of the device in action. It's placed here on a king-size bed frame next to a normal mattress that's been placed at the same height. This way sleeping partners can still share a bed. When the bed is made up, you can't tell it's anything other than a normal bed.